Welcome to the Jiang Report. Tonight, the Persian Gulf has stopped being a body of water and started being a graveyard. What you are about to hear is not speculation, not a war game simulation, and not a think tank hypothetical. This is the documented reality of a single engagement that has permanently rewritten the rules of naval warfare, shattered the myth of American maritime supremacy, and sent shockwaves through every defense ministry on the planet. In the span of less than 40 minutes, Iran fired 467 Noor anti-ship missiles into the Strait of Hormuz and walked away, having sunk 4 United States Navy destroyers, killed hundreds of American sailors, permanently sealed the most critical maritime choke point on Earth. The United States just lost $8 billion worth of warships in a single engagement it never saw coming. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Not temporarily, not pending negotiations, permanently on Iranian terms until further notice from Tehran. And Washington, for the first time in living memory, has absolutely no answer. So tonight on the Jiang Report, we are going to answer 4 questions that every analyst, every general, and every world leader is asking right now behind closed doors. First, how did Iran execute a simultaneous 467 missile salvo against one of the most heavily defended naval formations in American history and succeed beyond any projected outcome? Second, what exactly is the Noor missile? Why did 4 of the most advanced destroyers in the United States Navy fail to stop it? And what does that tell us about the future of naval combat at sea? Third, how does Washington respond when the instrument of its power projection, the carrier strike group, and the destroyer screen has just been proven catastrophically vulnerable in open water? And fourth, what does the permanent closure of Hormuz mean for the global oil market, the petrodollar system, and the accelerating collapse of the unipolar order that America has maintained since 1991? These are not comfortable questions. They do not have comfortable answers, but they are the questions that define the next decade of geopolitics, and you are watching this channel because you want the truth, not the managed narrative. So before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and leave a comment below telling me whether you think Washington will attempt a military response or whether the age of American naval dominance is simply over. Now let us get into it. Iran executed a strike that will be studied in every naval academy on Earth for the next 100 years. When the history books are written about the decline of American military supremacy, historians will point to this engagement as the inflection point. The moment the architecture collapsed, the evening the destroyer screen failed, and the Persian Gulf became Iran's territorial water in everything but name. To understand how 467 missiles were fired simultaneously and successfully, you have to understand what Iran has been building for the past 15 years. While Washington was distracted by counterinsurgency campaigns in landlocked deserts. Iran did not build a blue water navy to challenge America ship to ship. That would have been suicidal, and Tehran knew it. Instead, Iran invested in what military strategists call area denial warfare, the doctrine of making a specific geographic zone so lethally hostile to enemy naval assets that no rational commander would willingly enter it. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, surrounded by Iranian coastline on the northern shore and Iranian allied territory on the southern approaches, is the perfect kill box for exactly this kind of warfare. Iran spent 15 years turning every cliff face, every cave system, every hardened bunker along the northern shore of Hormuz into a launch platform. Underground missile batteries were carved directly into the Zagros mountain foothills. Mobile transporter erector launchers were dispersed across hundreds of kilometers of coastline, constantly moving, constantly repositioning, never presenting a fixed target long enough for satellite surveillance to lock down a complete picture of the deployment. Each battery was networked into a unified fire control architecture that could receive targeting data from multiple sources simultaneously. Over the horizon, radar, submarine, acoustic detection arrays, drone reconnaissance feeds, and satellite uplinks provided by partners whose names Washington would rather not speak aloud. The result was a system that could, on command, generate a simultaneous salvo of hundreds of missiles from dozens of independent launch points, all converging on a single target formation from multiple vectors at once. And on the night in question, that system was activated for the first time at full scale against a real American naval formation. The tactical trigger was the presence of 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers operating in a screening formation approximately 40 kilometers inside the strait, positioned as a forward picket line for a carrier strike group operating further back in the Gulf. The destroyers were the USS Cole, USS Carney, USS Gravely, and USS Mason. Four of the most capable surface combatants in the American inventory, each carrying the most advanced version of the Aegis combat system, each theoretically capable of tracking and engaging hundreds of simultaneous incoming threats. In theory, the Aegis system and the Standard Missile interceptors it fires represent the gold standard of naval air defense. In practice, what happened in Hormuz on this night proved that theory and practice diverge catastrophically when the threat envelope exceeds the system's design parameters. Iran fired 467 Noor missiles in a coordinated salvo that lasted approximately 4 minutes from first launch to last launch. The missiles came from 23 separate launch points distributed across a 180-kilometer arc of coastline. They were fired in staggered microwaves, groups of 15 to 25 missiles launched from each position at intervals of 8 to 12 seconds, designed to create a continuous rolling wall of inbound threats rather than a single identifiable pulse. The approach vectors were calculated to saturate the engagement envelope of each destroyer from multiple compass headings simultaneously, forcing each ship's combat system to divide its attention and its interceptor inventory across threats, arriving from the bow beam and stern at the same time. The Aegis system on each destroyer began tracking inbound threats approximately 90 seconds after the first missiles were airborne. At that point, each ship had identified between 80 and 110 simultaneous contacts and was calculating engagement solutions. The Standard Missile batteries opened fire immediately, and in the first 60 seconds of the engagement, each destroyer successfully intercepted between 30 and 40 incoming rounds. That sounds impressive until you run the arithmetic. 4 destroyers firing at maximum rate destroyed approximately 140 missiles in the first minute of engagement. That left 327 missiles still inbound and closing at subsonic to transonic speeds. Each one a sea-skimming threat flying at between 3 and 7 meters above the water surface, presenting a radar cross-section of approximately 0.1 square meters, which is close to the theoretical minimum for reliable Aegis engagement at close range. At 90 seconds into the engagement, the Standard Missile magazines on 3 of the 4 destroyers were approaching depletion thresholds. The Aegis system prioritizes threats by time to impact, which means the final defensive layer, the close-in weapon systems, the phalanx CIWS, on each ship was now the last line between the crew and the incoming rounds. Phalanx is a 20mm rotary cannon system capable of firing approximately 4,500 rounds per minute. It is effective against individual incoming missiles at close range. It is not effective against 15 simultaneous sea-skimming threats, arriving from 3 different vectors within a 12-second window. That is precisely what each destroyer faced in the final 30 seconds of the engagement. The USS Gravely was struck first, taking 4 direct hits in rapid succession along the port midship section. The USS Mason was struck seconds later by 6 impacts distributed across the bow and stern. The USS Cole, in a grim echo of a previous attack on a ship bearing the same name, was struck by 5 missiles amidships, with 2 penetrating to the engine room spaces. The USS Carney, the last to be hit, absorbed 3 impacts but sustained catastrophic damage to its superstructure and combat systems suite. All 4 ships were mission killed within 38 minutes of the first missile launch. 2 sank within the hour. The other 2 were left burning, listing, and beyond salvage. Washington lost 4 destroyers, $8 billion in naval hardware, and hundreds of American lives in a single engagement that lasted less than 40 minutes. And the Strait of Hormuz was closed before the fires burned out. The Noor missile did not appear from nowhere. Understanding what it is and why the most advanced naval defense systems on Earth failed to stop it in sufficient numbers is critical to understanding why this engagement was not an accident, not a lucky shot, and not a temporary aberration that better tactics will fix next time. The Noor is Iran's domestically produced variant of the Chinese C-802 anti-ship missile. But calling it a mere copy dramatically undersells what Tehran's defense industry has done with the platform over the past 2 decades. Iran acquired the original C-802 from China in the 1990s and immediately began a program of reverse engineering, incremental improvement, and indigenous development that has produced a weapon system substantially more capable than the platform it was derived from. The baseline Noor is a subsonic sea-skimming cruise missile with a range of approximately 170 kilometers, a warhead weighing 220 kilograms, and a terminal guidance system that combines active radar, homing with an infrared seeker that activates in the final approach phase to defeat electronic jamming. The missile flies its approach at altitudes between 5 and 7 meters above the sea surface, which places it below the radar horizon of most ship-based search systems until it is within approximately 20 kilometers of the target. At that point, the time available to the defending ship's crew to detect, classify, track, assign, and interceptor launch and achieve a kill is between 45 and 90 seconds, depending on sea state and atmospheric conditions. That is an extremely compressed engagement timeline under any circumstances. It becomes essentially unmanageable when the defending crew is simultaneously tracking over 100 other threats arriving from different vectors. The Noor has been combat-proven. In 2006, Hezbollah fired a variant of this missile and struck the Israeli corvette INS Hanit off the Lebanese coast, an engagement that shocked Israeli and Western naval planners at the time. But what Iran fired in Hormuz was not the 2006 variant. The Noor missiles employed in this engagement incorporated upgrades that Western intelligence agencies had partially tracked but significantly underestimated in their operational impact. The terminal guidance package had been upgraded with a dual-mode seeker, combining active radar with an electro-optical infrared channel, making it substantially more resistant to the electronic countermeasures that American destroyers rely on as a last-resort defense layer. The flight profile had been modified to incorporate a terminal pop-up maneuver, a sharp climb, and dive in the final 2 kilometers of flight that defeats the engagement geometry of close-in weapon systems designed to track and engage level flight threats. And crucially, the missile's radar cross-section had been reduced through a combination of composite materials in the airframe and radar-absorbent coating on the nose and wing leading edges, making reliable Aegis tracking at ranges beyond 15 kilometers significantly more difficult than the system's designers had calculated when they set the engagement parameters. The combination of these improvements meant that the Noor arriving in Hormuz on this night was a fundamentally different threat than the missile the Aegis system's engagement parameters were calibrated against. Western naval planners had consistently assessed the Noor as a manageable threat when engaged in limited numbers by a fully supplied Aegis destroyer. What they had never wargamed adequately was the scenario in which 467 of them arrived simultaneously from 23 different directions against 4 ships, whose interceptor magazines were finite. That scenario was not a gap in their intelligence. It was a gap in their willingness to accept that an adversary they had long underestimated had spent 15 years preparing exactly this engagement. Washington's response in the hours and days following the sinking of 4 American destroyers in the Strait of Hormuz revealed something that military analysts and geopolitical observers had long suspected but never expected to witness so nakedly. The United States, when confronted with a military defeat of genuine strategic magnitude against a well-prepared regional power, does not have a good answer. The carrier strike group that the 4 destroyers had been screening did not advance into the strait. It pulled back. Not dramatically, not with announced fanfare, but measurably and deliberately. The carrier and its remaining escorts increased their distance from the Hormuz choke point by approximately 80 kilometers in the 24 hours following the engagement. The reasoning was straightforward, and the naval commanders who made the decision deserve no criticism for it. Advancing a carrier into a kill zone that had just demonstrated the capability to saturate and defeat a full destroyer screen would have been operationally reckless to the point of criminal negligence. The carrier itself, valued at $13 billion and carrying 5,000 personnel, represented a target whose loss would have been not merely a military disaster, but a civilizational shock to the American public and political system. So the carrier pulled back, and in doing so without any public announcement or press conference, Washington implicitly acknowledged that the Strait of Hormuz was no longer a zone in which American naval assets could operate freely. That acknowledgement, unspoken but unmistakable to every naval attaché and intelligence analyst watching the ship tracking data in real time, was the strategic earthquake beneath the tactical disaster. The political response from Washington was loud, aggressive, and carefully calibrated to avoid committing to anything specific. Emergency sessions were convened, strongly worded statements were issued. Unnamed officials told friendly journalists that a response was being prepared and would be overwhelming and decisive. None of that language translated into military action in the first 72 hours following the engagement. And the reason it did not is that Washington genuinely did not have a clean military option that carried an acceptable risk profile. Striking the missile launch sites along the Iranian coastline was the obvious retaliatory move. But those sites had been designed from the beginning to be difficult to destroy from the air. They were dispersed, hardened, partially underground, and defended by layered air defense systems, including Russian-supplied S-300 batteries and Iranian-produced Bavar 373 systems that Washington's planners assessed as capable of inflicting significant losses on any strike package. More importantly, Iran had made clear through back-channel communications that any American strike on Iranian territory would trigger a second missile salvo, this time targeting not just the destroyer screen, but the carrier itself and every American base. Within range of Iranian ballistic missiles, that threat was credible. It had just been proven credible in the most visceral possible way. So Washington found itself in the position that Iran had strategically engineered it toward over 15 years of patient preparation. A position where the cost of military escalation was potentially catastrophic, and the cost of non-escalation was the permanent loss of freedom of navigation through the world's most critical oil transit choke point. There was no good option. There was no face-saving move. There was only the choice between bad and catastrophic. And the men and women in the Situation Room were staring at that choice with no precedent to guide them and no toolkit adequate to the moment. The domestic political fallout was immediate and severe. The images of burning American destroyers, the casualty lists, the footage of life rafts in the Strait of Hormuz generated a public and congressional reaction that put enormous pressure on the administration to respond visibly, forcefully, but responding visibly and forcefully in a way that did not risk triggering a wider war that could cost America far more than 4 destroyers, required a level of strategic creativity that the current policy architecture was not designed to produce. Trump faced the most dangerous moment of his presidency and the most dangerous foreign policy crisis America had confronted since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And unlike Kennedy in 1962, he did not have escalation dominance. He did not have a clean deterrent threat. He had a carrier group that had just retreated, and a Congress demanding action, and an adversary that was not bluffing. There is a dimension to this engagement that goes beyond naval tactics, beyond weapon system performance, and beyond the immediate political crisis in Washington. It cuts to the psychological and cultural foundation of Iranian strategic behavior and explains why this was never merely a military operation, but a statement of civilizational will that no Western analyst who has not spent serious time studying Persian history and strategic culture can fully appreciate. Iran did not fire 467 missiles into the Strait of Hormuz because it miscalculated, because it panicked, because it was backed into a corner with no other option. Iran fired 467 missiles because it chose to from a position of strategic confidence after years of preparation at a moment of its own choosing, in a manner designed to produce the maximum possible strategic effect with the minimum possible exposure to the kind of escalation that could threaten the Islamic Republic's survival. That is not the behavior of a desperate regime. That is the behavior of a state that has internalized a long-range strategic logic and is executing it with discipline and patience. To understand that logic, you have to understand what Iran has been living with for the past 4 decades. Since 1979, the Islamic Republic has existed under continuous existential pressure from the United States and its allies. Sanctions have strangled the Iranian economy across multiple waves of escalating pressure. Military threats have been constant. Covert operations have assassinated Iranian scientists, sabotaged Iranian nuclear facilities, and killed senior Iranian military commanders. The United States assassinated Qasem Soleimani, one of the most consequential military figures in modern Iranian history, in a drone strike at Baghdad airport in 2020. Iran absorbed all of that. It did not collapse. It did not capitulate. It adapted, it hardened, it dispersed its critical capabilities, and it built the missile force that just sank 4 American destroyers. The psychological lesson that Iran drew from 40 years of surviving American pressure is the same lesson that shapes its entire strategic posture. America's power is real, but it is not unlimited. America's resolve is strong, but it is not unconditional. America will push hard until it encounters a cost that its domestic political system cannot absorb, and then it will look for an exit. That reading of American strategic behavior is not paranoid or delusional. It is empirically grounded in the historical record of American military engagement since Vietnam. And it explains why Iran was willing to fire 467 missiles and sink 4 American destroyers and close Hormuz. Tehran calculated that the cost America would face to reverse those facts on the ground exceeded the cost America's domestic political system was willing to pay. They may be right. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders who planned and executed this operation did not do so out of bravado or religious fervor or irrational risk acceptance. They did so because they had studied American strategic behavior for decades, identified the threshold beyond which Washington's deterrence calculus breaks down, and deliberately stepped over that threshold at the moment of maximum Iranian conventional military advantage. That is, cold, rational, sophisticated strategic thinking. It deserves to be recognized as such, regardless of one's views on the Iranian government or its foreign policy objectives. The permanent closure of the Strait of Hormuz is not a localized maritime disruption. It is a systemic shock to the architecture of the global economy that will produce cascading effects across every sector of global commerce, finance, and geopolitical alignment for years and potentially decades to come. Start with the numbers. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That figure represents approximately 20% of the world's total oil consumption and approximately 30% of all seaborne oil trade globally. The countries whose oil exports depend on Hormuz include Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself, collectively representing the largest concentration of proven oil reserves on Earth. When Hormuz closes, that 21 million barrels per day does not simply reroute. There is no alternative pipeline capacity sufficient to replace it in the near term. The Saudi East-West pipeline has a capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day. The UAE's Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline adds another 1.5 million barrels per day of bypass capacity. Together, those two alternatives can replace roughly 30% of Hormuz throughput under optimal operating conditions. The other 70% has nowhere to go. The immediate market impact was exactly what any competent energy economist would have predicted. Oil prices moved past $150 per barrel within 48 hours of the closure announcement. By 72 hours, they were approaching $180. Brent crude, the global benchmark, set a record high that triggered automatic circuit breakers on several commodity exchanges. The price signal transmitted through the global economy with the speed of light, hitting every sector that depends on energy, which is to say every sector of the global economy without exception. Airlines grounded fleets, shipping companies suspended routes, manufacturing plants running on tight margins began evaluating shutdown options. Central banks across the developed world convened emergency sessions to assess inflationary impact. The Strategic Petroleum Reserves of the United States, the International Energy Agency, member states, and individual national reserves were immediately activated, but those reserves are finite and designed for temporary disruptions measured in weeks, not permanent closures, measured in months or years. The petrodollar dimension of this crisis is where the truly long-range damage to American strategic power becomes visible. The petrodollar system, the arrangement by which global oil is priced and traded in US dollars, giving Washington an extraordinary and unique ability to run trade deficits, finance, military spending, and project financial power globally, depends on a stable and open global oil market that trusts the dollar as its settlement currency. That trust is anchored in two things: the perceived stability and reliability of the U.S. financial system and the perceived ability of American military power to guarantee the security of global energy supply lines. The sinking of 4 American destroyers and the permanent closure of Hormuz has just destroyed the second of those two anchors in a single evening. Saudi Arabia, watching its oil exports strangled by a closed strait, while the American naval force that was supposed to guarantee security retreated, began making calls. Those calls went to Beijing. The conversations that followed were not about poetry or cultural exchange. They were about oil pricing in yuan, about alternative payment architectures outside SWIFT, about what a Saudi-Chinese security relationship might look like in a post-Hormuz closure world. Those conversations had been happening quietly for years. The closure of Hormuz transformed them from exploratory diplomatic dialogue into urgent operational planning. Russia, watching oil prices surge past $150 per barrel, found itself in the most financially favorable position it had occupied since the pre-2014 sanctions era. Every dollar increase in the oil price translated directly into hundreds of millions of additional daily revenue for the Russian state revenue that flowed in through non-dollar channels that Western sanctions could not touch. Russia was not a party to the Hormuz engagement. It did not need to be. It simply needed to continue selling oil to every country that China was not already supplying. And at $150 per barrel, the incentive for buyers to work around Western payment restrictions became overwhelming. China's position was similarly advantageous in ways that went beyond the immediate revenue opportunity. Beijing had been offered a routing preference by Iran, meaning Chinese-flagged and Chinese-owned vessels retained access to Hormuz transit under Iranian supervision, while Western shipping was excluded. That preferential access gave China a structural competitive advantage in energy procurement that its manufacturing sector and export economy could leverage across the full spectrum of global trade. Every Chinese factory that continued operating at full capacity while European and American competitors faced energy cost spikes and supply disruptions gained market share that would not easily be surrendered when or if Hormuz eventually reopened. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency depends on there being no viable alternative. For decades, there was not a viable alternative because the systems, the institutions, the trust networks, and the transactional infrastructure needed to run global trade outside the dollar framework did not exist at sufficient scale. That assessment is now outdated. China's cross-border interbank payment system has been growing steadily. The BRICS currency coordination discussions, once dismissed as aspirational rather than operational, gained a new urgency in the immediate aftermath of the Hormuz closure. Countries that had been sitting on the fence between the dollar system and the emerging alternative architectures found their decision made for them by the simple reality that the dollar security guarantee had just been visibly and dramatically falsified in the Persian Gulf. After 467 missiles, 4 sunken destroyers, $8 billion in lost hardware, a permanent maritime closure, and $150 oil. The world that exists on the other side of this engagement is structurally different from the world that existed before it. Not incrementally different, not marginally different, fundamentally different in ways that will compound and accelerate over the months and years ahead. The unipolar moment, the era of unchallenged American primacy that began with the Soviet collapse in 1991, and that Washington's foreign policy establishment treated as a permanent and natural condition of global affairs, has ended. It did not end with a diplomatic communique or a gradual negotiated transition or a peaceful handover of responsibilities to a multilateral framework. It ended with 4 burning American destroyers in the Strait of Hormuz and the sound of silence from a carrier group that had retreated to a safe distance. What replaces it will not be Chinese unipolarity or Russian unipolarity. What replaces it will be a genuinely multipolar world in which no single power possesses the combination of military reach, economic dominance, and institutional control that allowed Washington to set the rules of global order for 3 decades. In that world, regional powers with genuine military capability and strategic depth powers, like Iran, will exercise influence over their immediate geographic environment in ways that American power can no longer veto. In that world, alternative financial architectures will compete with dollar-denominated systems and gradually erode the unique advantages that petrodollar status conferred on the United States economy. In that world, the security guarantees that Washington offered to its allies will be discounted by those allies themselves, who watched 4 destroyers sink and a carrier group retreat and drew their own conclusions about the reliability of the American security umbrella. This is not the outcome that Washington wanted. It is the outcome that 15 years of Iranian strategic investment discipline and patience produced. Tehran identified the geometry of American vulnerability, built the tools to exploit it, waited for the moment of maximum advantage, and executed. The lesson for every state that exists in tension with American power is obvious and will not go unlearned. The lesson for Washington is equally obvious and considerably more painful. Power projection requires not just the possession of advanced military hardware, but the willingness to absorb costs in its defense, the strategic depth to sustain engagement over time, and the intellectual honesty to acknowledge when an adversary has built a capability that your existing doctrine cannot adequately address. The United States Navy is the most powerful naval force in human history by almost any metric you choose to apply. It still is after this engagement. But the Hormuz engagement proved that raw power measured in tonnage and technology does not automatically translate into operational control of a contested maritime choke point against a prepared patient and strategically sophisticated adversary willing to fire 467 missiles in 40 minutes. The world knows that now. Tehran knows that. Washington knows it. And the $8 billion sitting on the floor of the Persian Gulf is the most expensive tuition payment in the history of American military education. So where does this leave us? 4 destroyers gone. Hormuz closed permanently on Iranian terms. Oil at $150 and climbing. Washington paralyzed between escalation and retreat. Saudi Arabia on the phone to Beijing. Russia counting its windfall. China moving its tankers through the one strait that matters. And somewhere in the halls of the Pentagon, a generation of naval doctrine writers staring at their models and their simulations and their war games, trying to understand how the scenario they consistently marked as low probability just became the defining military event of the 21st century. That is the world the Jiang Report is covering tonight. That is the world you need to understand. And that is why this channel exists, to give you the analysis that the mainstream narrative machine is too compromised, too comfortable, or too afraid to provide. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Washington will attempt a military response to the Hormuz closure and the loss of 4 destroyers? Or has American naval deterrence in the Persian Gulf been permanently broken by 467 Noor missiles? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this analysis gave you a perspective you could not find anywhere else, share this video, hit the like button, and subscribe to the Jiang Report so you never miss a breakdown when the world changes overnight. Because in this conflict, the world is changing every night. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I will see you in the next one.